Well, today we have a very special Life on Books episode. I'm joined by author and translator KE Semmel and KE Semmel superfan Mike, who's part of our book club. This evening, we're going to be talking about translated literature and a whole bunch of other stuff. Thank you so much for joining us, by the way.
Thank you for having me.
And Mike, thanks to you as well for joining us. So this conversation was kind of spawned because we read Rock, Paper, Scissors, and you are the translator for this. So we want to get into translation. You're also an author of your own original works, which we want to talk about as well. But we start every segment with a reading update. So Kay, tell us what you've been reading lately.
You know, I've been listening to your podcast, and I noticed that you do that. And I meant to make a list of things, and I didn't do that. One of the best books I've read recently is All the Troubles of Our Days, I believe it is called. It's a World War II. It's a nonfiction, and I'm struggling to remember the author's name, but it's not coming to me at the moment. The book I'm reading is an audiobook. Now, I will say that as you know, I work full time, so I'm driving back and forth. I live near Rochester, New York, and I work in Buffalo, near Buffalo. So I just do a lot of audiobooks. And I'm reading a book called The Plot at the moment, which I'm not particularly in love with. But it's one of those books that you kind of read for the sense of, well, okay, so this is what this author is doing, and this is where I would do it differently. And there's really an educational component to that I appreciate.
Very cool. And you also just reread the book that you translated as well, correct?
I did do that, yeah. And I didn't quite get finished. Unfortunately, I've had a lot of things going on, but I did have to try to read it again because it's been around at least 13 years since I even opened this book. It's been a long time since I translated it, so I had to refresh my memory. And I did bring a copy, and I want to show this. This is my original copy of the book, if I can get it there, and how it looks inside. It's as you see, the spine is gone, basically, if they can see that. I've opened it so often, and it's been gently, you can't even see it. I'm trying to get it there. You could gently loved, and a lot of margin notes and notes to myself as a translator while going through and just kind of figuring out what I wanted to say or how I was going to translate each particular line or word or things like that. So
awesome. I'm really excited to, I've got a bunch of questions lined up for you about the translating process. I know Mike probably does as well. Mike, do you want to just give us a quick rundown of what you've been reading?
Yeah, maybe an all-time low for anybody on this podcast. I'm only reading 2 books at once.
That was me right now, and I didn't even remember the names of the authors. So
I am reading Beware of Pity for our book club, and then I am also making my way through A Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I am reading my way through the entirety of the Cosmere this year, which is 19 novels, and 5 of them are 1,100 plus pages each. So it's taking me a while.
I'm reading also Beware of Pity and Matterhorn by Karl Marlantes. So, okay.
That's been on your list for a while to get to, right?
It has. We put it up for a vote one month, and it didn't win, which I was disappointed with, but it is what it is. So, cool. Mike, I know you've got a bunch of questions, but I would love to tackle the kind of translation part of the conversation to start. So I guess, can you give us a little bit of a background on how you ended up learning Danish, why Danish, and how you ended up getting into the translation game and translating this book specifically?
Sure thing. Before I say that, I do want to. So the title is All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, and it's Rebecca Donner is the author of that. So I did want to at least get that part. Yeah. So I've always obviously been interested in literature, reading as much as possible. In college, skipping class to write and read was something I did quite frequently. And I got a graduate degree in literature. And while I was getting that degree, I also was studying German. And I got a scholarship to study in Gießen, Germany. And while I was in graduate school in the U.S., but the same program, I met a woman from Denmark, and that's what really started this ball rolling. We moved to Denmark, spent a few years there. I was a mailman while I was living there. And at the same time, I was reading a lot of books in Danish. And because, I always like to say this, because German and Danish have similarities, particularly as they relate to English, then it was easier for me to pick up the language. The hardest part is always going to be the pronunciation. Danish is a much more difficult language to pronounce than certainly American English. And I just wanted to do it because I liked reading. As I was reading in Danish, I would always kind of mentally translate the words I was reading. And so I one day decided that I would just kind of start doing it. And I didn't actually start doing it, believe it or not, until we moved back to the States. It would have made a lot more sense if we had stayed in the U.S. or in Denmark for me to actually translate in Denmark. But my wife's got accepted to do a PhD program over here, and so we moved back. And it was then I was like, I didn't want to lose the language that I had learned, and so I was like, now I'm going to finally do it. And so I picked up a book by an author named Simon Frueland, which I've translated 3 of his books now. I have a full of them here. But it was this particular book, Milk and Other Stories, that I picked up, published by the Santa Fe Writers Project, or SFWP, after a long time of trying to find a publisher for it. And I just started translating the stories. And when I was done with a story, I found the author's contact information online, and I basically sent it to him, and I said, I translated this. What do you think? Can I do some more? And he was very appreciative and very positive about the translation, and basically we developed a friendship after that. And I translated the entire book. It didn't take me terribly long because it's only about 120 pages. And it's about 12 stories, so they're all fairly short. And basically the hardest part was really finding a publisher for that, because there wasn't really a market for somewhat low-key, funny but subdued humor kind of writers like Simon in the U.S. And he wasn't entirely best-selling novelist in Denmark. So I had to create the kind of market for him here. I will say that his second book, Civil Twilight, which is, I've kind of described it as a bit of a David Markson type of book, which isn't quite the case, but it's the closest I can come. It's essentially like the film Slacker. It takes you along a suburb of Copenhagen, basically from house to house, and you meet the characters on the street through the house. And so it kind of develops a plot, but not really. But that book, believe it or not, even though it may seem like it's a slow pace and kind of no real plot or no real character development, it was a bestseller in Denmark. But that came out after Milk. So in any event, he just, I did it out of love, essentially. So this is a long-winded answer, I think, for your question, but that's how I got into translation. And once I got to more and more translations, then publishers started to approach me. And I was also very much helped by one Danish translator who basically suggested I be the translator of this one particular book. So that was also a big plus for me. That's how
I mean, that must be a nice feather in your cap to have, somebody who is saying, hey, this is the guy to do the work.
Yeah, that felt really good. And it's a nice thing when a translator does that for another translator. And I've made a point, as much as I can, when I'm asked to do a project that I cannot do, or for time reasons or whatever, that I suggest a translator, and I've been glad to do that a few times.
And how did this project with rock, paper, scissors specifically come along?
I'm trying to remember if I knew or had met Naja before I translated the book. I believe we had met. I'm almost certain we had met, because I used to work for a literary center in the DC area, and I'm almost certain that I had translated. Sorry, that I had brought her over along with Simon and another Danish writer named Pia Tafta for a reading over there, but not obviously from this particular book. Would have probably been from Baboon, which won a lot of prizes here, and is a terrific book. Also very, very characteristic, very similar in certain styles to Rock, Paper, Scissors. And I really liked Naja. I really do, and we got along quite well. And so I'm friends with Chad Post, the publisher of Open Letter, obviously. And one day, I guess he just emailed and said, we have this book, Rock, Paper, Scissors by Naja. Are you interested? And of course, I said yes. And I had already read it. That was the cool part. I had actually read both Baboon, and Rock, Paper, Scissors previously. So I was very familiar with the Rock, Paper, Scissors, and I loved it. So I jumped at the chance to do it.
And Mike, have you read any of those yet? I know you kind of were digging deep on the catalog here.
I read Baboon, and then I can't remember the full. I think it's if Death takes something from you, give it back. The other collection, that was also fantastic, and obviously a lot more centered on her grieving process for her son that passed away.
Yeah.
But my first question about Rock, Paper, Scissors is because it was a very polarizing book for our book club. Was what did you think of Thomas as a character when you were reading it, but also more importantly when you were translating it as well?
Yeah. Well, Thomas is not a completely likable guy.
It's understatement of the year, but
he does some piss poor things. In this particular, the newest read, and I have to confess, I don't quite remember how I felt about him back then, other than like, my God, he's just really a hard character to like. I'm almost certain that I would have had that thought, 15 years ago as well. But he's very manic, and obviously his childhood with his dad certainly impacted his adulthood. And I think there's a moment, and it's one of my favorite scenes, and I was reminded of it when I was rereading this book. There's a moment in which Thomas goes to a beach, and he is lying on the sand, and he has this memory of his father and him. It's not really a memory, but he has this vision of his father and him intertwined. And I feel like that's the nub right there, because Thomas is, his dad was a criminal, and in some respects, so is Thomas. And he rapes basically his girlfriend, and he's just got somewhat miserable at times, but he's also very manic. He goes from having these moments of like joy and happiness where he's fun to be around, and then other times he's depressive and really difficult to hear. So I guess I'm hoping I'm answering your question, Mike. I think he's a tough one in a way, but I think that moment on the beach kind of goes back and kind of wraps them together as and I don't want to overthink the symbology of it, but it kind of wraps them together in that kind of an embrace, or more like a criminal embrace. At the same time, I will say that, there are some parts of him that, I can appreciate, so he's not all bad, but he is tough to like at times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting things about the character for me is that he has spent his entire adult life trying to be everything that his father wasn't. He wants to be the polar opposite. He doesn't want to be a father at all. He wants to, obey the law and wants to do all these things. Then as soon as he loses his father as that antagonist in his own story, everything kind of goes off the rail because there's no force pushing equally back against him anymore. So he just veers off track completely. And I mean, anybody that's read the book, I mean, it's tough to read at a lot of points. I found the book to be really entertaining to read. Obviously, there's a lot of dark subject matter, and particularly, I think one of the most interesting things is that what I've read of like Scandinavian literature has a very direct way of dealing with darker things, particularly sex as well, where to, I guess, American readers, it can come off cavalier or just kind of blasé about it. I still remember people reading Stieg Larsson when the movies were being super popular, and then going and reading the book and just being like, oh my God, he's describing these things in a way that's like, he doesn't feel human. There's no like emotion in the description.
Yeah. And there certainly are moments of that. I mean, again, I go back to the rape scene. But even in Babooned, I think you recall one particular story. This has been many, many years since I read it, but it was also a rape scene, if I'm not mistaken, involving anal sex, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's a coldness to some of these scenes for sure.
Like I said, I think there's just something really precise about that language, and I think that it often gets misinterpreted by American readers as coldness or like a distance. But I think it, in the same way that like a very verbose author has to very carefully choose their words to make sure that they're not losing the plot in a really long paragraph, I think it's also very powerful for someone to be able to transmit that same message in a very short, direct sentence.
Yeah, I mean, okay, if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about what were some of the I guess translational challenges going from Danish to English? Because this is something we're talking about quite a bit. We're currently reading "Beware of Pity" by Stefan Zweig, which was originally written in Austrian German, and there's some instances where we do actually have a member of our book club who's reading it in the original language, and there are some instances where clearly, the translator had to kind of manipulate what was said because there is no direct translation. So, what are some of the quirks of maybe Danish specifically that make it an interesting challenge?
Yeah, this is always an interesting question, simply because, and in this case, because it's been so long. One of the biggest challenges I have had in this book was, really with the poetry that comes in later. In a large section where they're off, at a retreat, like Kristen and Helena's, two characters in the book, they go off to Thomas's, the aunts, I think of his. And I'm not a huge, and I've never really translated poetry. Um, I like reading poetry, but I certainly don't have the breadth or depth of knowledge with poetry. And some of these, as I recall, I did translate myself. Others, if they were already translated, I found a translation that both I and Naja agreed would work, and went with that. But the translating poetry has never been my thing, and with this book, it's somewhat difficult. Well, I shouldn't say difficult at all. It's more that with Naja is a very obviously a poet. She's a poet, and she writes with her poet sensibility here. And this maybe goes back to a little bit Mike was saying, about the precision of the language. And there's obviously a lot of poetry in this book, even in sections where these characters. When you think about this today, like how many people can recite poems, or how many people have read Walt Whitman and talk about it casually in a conversation, and they talk about it very casually in this book. I'm not sure, and I'm entirely answering your question, Tony, but that I do remember and recall is one of the hardest things. That's not necessarily specific to the Danish language. The one thing that I can say that's specific to the Danish language, and it's specific to a number of Danish writers, is it's much more common to have long chunks of text and use commas instead of, say, periods or semicolons. And this is not also just strictly in Danish. It's also very other European languages as well. And so that kind of navigating, having it be, as true to the original as possible, but also understanding that the reading audience in the U.S. in particular, and England too, but the U.S. is obviously what I was writing for. That may not be a style that they are going to be latching onto and enjoying, and would it detract from ultimately the book itself? And I chose essentially. I had a conversation with Naja about this, and she was like, I want it to sound like, and this is my memory of what she said, but this is a paraphrase of my memory. So there you go. That I want it to sound like it was written in English. And so to that end, I used my discretion and said, well, I'm going to use more periods and even some semicolons. I didn't overdo the semicolons because that's not really a thing quite as common in Danish, but I definitely used a lot more periods with that in mind, wanting it to sound like the flow was more like what it might be in an American book.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because one of the big talking points in the book club was that this book felt like it could have been taken place almost anywhere in the world, or in fact, it did feel like quite American. Mike, I believe you said it had like a kind of Chicago feel to it for you.
Yeah, I don't know what it was about the descriptions of the city that just immediately made me think of either Chicago or Boston. And I even read an interview with Naja where she said that it was very intentional on her part to leave out any names of cities. The only clue that we get that this happens in the Scandinavian region is the mountain that she mentions the name of the mountain once, of where they go to, where Thomas, Luke, and Alice go to hike. Other than that, we have no descriptor of where that is. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess your mission was accomplished.
Well, I mean, her mission, really. I just followed that mission, and I really appreciate that. And it was definitely deliberate on her part to keep that vague. She was at the time living in Brooklyn, if that gives you any kind of maybe clue. And she does, and one of the things, and I can't remember if this was in the original, but the use of the word bodegas is in here. And you may recall, either one of you might recall this. And we had a conversation about this because this points really to New York City, does it not? So
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it does come into play in this book, but it also is clearly not set in New York City. But like it could be anywhere. And that's part of the beauty of it, I think. Even with their names. I mean, their names are all over the map.
Yes.
And, Ernesto and the Luke
Thomas
Frank.
O'Malley Lindstrom and
Maloney, Jenny. Such an arch American name, Jenny and Alice. But then there's Luke and Luke. I can't even pronounce that. The French Luke and Luke.
Luke and Luke.
Luke, thank you. How are you supposed to do that? Or Jacques, the father. I mean, all of these, like, it's definitely, Western culture. That's what we can say.
So it sounds like there was quite a bit of collaboration between you and Naja then during the translation process, which I know is not always the case. I mean, for example, in the first book you translated, you just, took it upon yourself. Obviously, there's lots of people who are translating works of authors who aren't alive anymore. So what is kind of like that process like when you are working with an author? She obviously speaks English, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. So is it like you do a little bit, you send it over? Do you do the whole thing and she gives you feedback and then you revise? How does that process work?
So in this case, and in fact, in any case I've ever done it, and it's really, I've translated books without any input from the author, and I've translated books like this or with Simon. Like if I know the author and I really want to hear what their feedback, I will have the complete manuscript done, and then I will ask them if they want to read it. And I had enough time, and Chad is always Chad and Kaya. Kaya was the editor. Kaya Astronomist, very open to allowing Naja to read it. And I certainly was, because I wanted to get it right, and when I look at this, I think it is her novel, right? And I believe in the work that I do, but at the same time, anytime you write a book and then it gets translated into a primary language like English, you want it to be the best possible book. And so that's what I wanted for Naja. And she, as I recall, we didn't have a whole lot of at that point. At the end, there wasn't a whole lot of changes at that stage. Throughout the process, I would ask her questions. I do recall that, and in particular, when it got to the poetry scenes I mentioned earlier, I would ask her like some of these poets and like which versions of the poems did you consult? Like how do I find the right poems to make sure if these are translated from one language into Danish, what is I think Whitman is the example where the books were translated into Danish. I, obviously had to translate them, or not. I didn't translate them back. I just grabbed them from the original Whitman. But little things like that we would talk about on occasion. And obviously the question I mentioned before about the commas, and just wanted to make sure, I did it the way she wanted, because I would use fewer commas naturally in my own writing, but I wanted, to obviously consult with her on what I would do in that scenario. So there was some give and take back and forth, usually just in the form of the emails that I would ask her.
Yeah, I can imagine that poetry is tough because like we had Chad on the podcast, and he's obviously got a lot of experience just working with translators. And he was kind of telling us like sometimes there might be some phrase or maybe a paragraph that if you did a literal translation, it just wouldn't really make sense to an English reader. So the translator has to kind of move things around to make it less clunky or whatever. But with poetry, it needs to be like as true as possible to and you're working typically with far fewer words with poetry. So,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I just don't, unfortunately, it's just not my strength. So.
Yeah. Hey, look, I speak one language, so the fact that you're out here translating books is incredible. So you speak German and Danish. Are there any other languages in addition to English?
Well, I no longer speak German. Once we moved to Denmark, basically my mind warped into Danish. And so if I'm trying to speak German now, there will be Danish and English phrases that will sprinkle the way in.
Nice.
I do read it, not at a translator's level though anymore, but I do read it, and I love hearing it. And it really, the German language was one of my, really my first, from an early age when I was trying to learn it with my dad. And so that was always a language that meant a lot for me. Norwegian is a language I've translated as well before, but that's much similar to the Danish. Not
awesome.
In pronunciation, of course. I don't speak Norwegian. That's different.
Sure. No problem. Hey, all good. Mike, I know you had a bunch of questions. I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, so that actually kind of segues perfectly into one of the questions I wanted to ask. And KE, have you by chance read Babel by R.F. Kuang?
No, you guys just talked about that on a recent podcast, though.
Yeah, it was I think
Tony and Andy, I guess.
So, the magic, it's a historical fantasy, and the magic system is very heavily based on translating words from dead languages to fresh languages and carving those on bars of silver. So this all happens at Oxford University. And when they're going to translator school, there's an entire lecture in the book about how fine of a balance translating either what they describe as verbum a verbum, word for word, or sensum a sensu, which is sense for sense, which is like looking at the meaning of it, and how much of like a tightrope that is that you have to walk because like, do I want to stay perfectly true to the language, or do I want to stay perfectly true to the author's perceived intent? Obviously, if you're working with a non-living author, it's a bit more difficult, but
Yeah.
I wanted to get a sense of what that balancing act was like for you.
Um, well, I think the first and foremost, at least for me, um, and a lot of the books I translated were crime novels. So these aren't books that are, you know, traditionally considered. I don't like making kind of distinction between say art and genre and all this other stuff, but they're they're much more purposeful in a sense. Language is used as a construct to develop a narrative that gets people to read page after page after page. And you don't really find a William Faulkner in that genre, you know? So it's a different layer or different level of language that you're dealing with there. So in that sense, I think it's, you for me at least, you're trying to do as close to the word, as closest to the page maybe as possible. But there are certainly some expressions or phrases that you simply can't get to exactly. And so you want the sense of what that particular passage is going for. Um, so I think it's a combination of both, if that, answers your question. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
And segueing off of that again, so I did read your debut novel, The Book of Losman. I really really enjoyed this, especially as a neurodiverse individual. And one of the passages that I flagged was because, so I guess where I should start is that how autobiographical is this? Because a couple things, I'm from upstate New York. My sister lives in Rochester. I'm from Elmira, which is not far from that at all. And then I moved to Philly. So connecting with Daniel Losman was very, very easy to do because you're talking about Philly all the time in here. And I was like, oh man, this is great.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Your question was how autobiographical. Okay, so I like to play the Zuckerman novels. Remember the Philip Roth Zuckerman novels and how playful he was with the fact that it's basically Philip Roth, but not either. And I was a big fan in my early days of Philip Roth, and I read pretty much everything he ever wrote. And one of the things that I think I absorbed from him bodily, if not intellectually, was that with fiction, you can be really playful with just how much is real and not real. And I'm somewhat hesitant to answer entirely the question of how much is autobiographical, but only because I want, readers to kind of have their own thoughts on that. That said, it is fiction. And so the plot involves a literary translator with Tourette syndrome who gets involved in a dubious drug trial and takes pills that helps him recall his childhood and babyhood memories. I have never done that.
Wow.
So to my knowledge, those things don't exist. And in that respect, I have always considered it a speculative fiction. But obviously the translation parts, the Tourette's parts, the Danish parts, all those were there. And that's part of my life. But I'd spent a number of years writing multiple drafts of a manuscript that was a retelling of Beowulf, set in Western New York, during the whole fracking situation. So I wanted to make it like a, these monsters coming out and killing people in the hall because of fracking, because we're drawing oil from the ground. And I like I said, I did about 17 drafts of that, and eventually got an agent, got through the whole thing, and the book was shopped around, and it went nowhere. But I spent a lot of time, 10 years doing that. And so I decided that with this one, I would stick to the things, follow that old mantra that I never followed before of writing what you know. And so that's why That's why it ended up being what it is, because I just wanted to write something that didn't take me 10 years. Instead, it only took me 5. So
So you have an unpublished, another manuscript that's unpublished.
I have a number, but that was the one that got me the closest before this one.
What would you say is like the? I mean, it maybe seems like an obvious question, but like as far as the process of translating versus writing something original, obviously, I would imagine it takes you much longer to write something original. But what are some of the big differences and the challenges, and what do you enjoy maybe about each one versus the other?
Well, one of the things I really enjoy about the translation part is that the structure, the story, it's all there. And for that, it's just you are transferring it into your own language. And I like the challenge of that. I like looking at a sentence and saying, well, how does this work in English? And with my translation, I would always go through it multiple times. So the first draft, I'm really just spewing it out on the page or on my computer. And I'm not worried at all about where the words are in a sentence. I just am getting it literally down. And so with each successive pass through the novel, I would, get it cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, and to the point where I'm reshaping it from the Danish syntax into the American syntax. And that's when it gets exciting for me. I really do like that process, especially after the first draft through, because the first draft is dull. But once you get to the point where you're starting to shape and craft the language, I think it's really exciting. But it's all there already. With the creative work, I just it is more of a challenge because the structure is not there. You have to find your own structure, and you have to do your own research of it. I mean, you research certain things for the translation as well to make sure that actually is possible. It's something that may be in the original that may have not been copied. I'm not sure if this is real, or if this is even possible, or if the timeline's all messed. That's the one thing about translation is often I find myself editing the original as I'm going along, because at least in terms of Danish books I can speak for, there's not always, I don't think, a copy editor doing what American copy editors have traditionally done at big publishers here in the States. And that is like fact checking or line editing certain things. And so
Yeah.
I did do a lot of that. But with my own creative writing, it tends to be like, I have to do all that research by myself. I have to do, I have to think of the story by myself. And that can be a challenge, but it's also extremely fun. So it just takes a lot of work. So
No doubt. And I'm just curious also if it helped at all getting published. I mean, getting published is quite difficult, as you clearly know. As you mentioned, you have several unpublished manuscripts. Do you feel like it helped you to get published, having done the translational work?
I wish I could say it did, but I don't think it did. I will say that Milk and Other Stories was published by SFWP. It's a small indie press, independent, a small press. I make the distinction here because a lot of, it's a small press, and it's been around for 30 years or so. So they published Milk and Other Stories in like 2013, 2015, something like that. And that was part of the pitch to them this time around with the Book of Losman. So in that sense, it did help because I should tell you that, and Mike, you might appreciate this, the opening chapter of the Book of Losman is a retelling of a story from Milk. I inserted basically a fictional character, Losman, into this story and let that kind of play out. And I got Simon's permission, of course, but I always like to tell people that because it's kind of an homage to Simon and his work, because I really find it fascinating. I think I've learned a lot from translating Simon. Also because he's got great ideas about what fiction is. He used to be a book buyer at Gyldendal, the largest publisher in Denmark. And so he's got great ideas on fiction. And so I've learned a lot from him. And that was an homage to him. So in that sense, I suppose it was a little easier getting the book of Losman published with that particular press. But even this one, I had an agent for this one, and at all the major presses, I got great feedback, but no one was willing to buy it. And I think part of that is the difficulty of fiction today, and selling it, and trying to get people to read debut novelists. I think that can be a challenge, and I think a lot of publishers are risk averse. And I know with my Beowulf novel, they basically said, "Well, what is this? It's a American Scandinavian crime novel, horror. It's a literary thriller. What is this?" And they couldn't place it. That's what the tenor of the comments essentially was. So, that's the way it is sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, being able to put something neatly into a box makes it a lot easier to market it for sure. So
Yeah.
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 Mike, what else have you read? Have you read anything else that KE's translated?
Yeah, I also read The World in Barbara, which I really enjoyed this one. I messaged you about it the other day. Why there were so many times where I was reading this, I'm like, what am I reading? But I couldn't stop. I finished it in a single sitting because I just kept on going I need to know what happens. But loosely, I mean, I guess KE, I should let you describe it.
Yeah, so it's a novel where there's a young writer who's a bit of a ne'er-do-well, but a writer nevertheless. He got one tiny book of poems or stories. I can't remember which it is. But he is assigned to write the memoirs of a famous 79-and-a-half-year-old actress who's the idea is that this book has to be finished by the time she's 80, so they can have a book published when she's 80, and they can celebrate this woman and her birthday with this book. But of course, he kind of botches the assignment and ends up getting involved with cricket fighting in China, which I know gets a little bit completely out of the way, but he gets involved with some dubious deals with one of his, basically Valvera's boyfriend is a diamond smuggler and a little bit shady. And when Pele is his name, when he gets in trouble and he needs money, this diamond trader whose name is Knud sends him off on these trips, and he does these dangerous things. And one ends up getting him. Sorry, I'm confusing two different things. He does these things, but then his girlfriend gets involved with the crickets in China. So I messed that up. It's been a while since I read that one too. But the girlfriend gets involved with crickets in China, and Pele goes to China to get her out of China, essentially. But as you can see, the book doesn't get finished, at least as far as with him, in the way that it was supposed to get finished. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I don't think I've read a book that covered so many countries and continents in so few pages. And I mean the scene with the crickets in China and then all that whole aftermath is, like I said, I was just I was like, I have no what am I reading? This is insane. I loved it. It was just really, really interesting. And I think so. I read obviously Rock Paper Scissors first, and then I read your debut novel, and then I read The World in Barbara. And I, how much would you say that your translation work has really shaped your writing? Because I found that reading the Book of Losman, it did very much feel like it had some of that, you know, precision and short and sweet sentences that I think are kind of very well associated with Scandi writing.
Yeah, certainly with Simon's work, I think Simon's work shaped not just in the characters that are there, but also some of the themes that are there. And he's definitely shaped me in many ways. And Rock Paper Scissors did as well. I mean, Rock Paper Scissors was and still is one of my favorite translations. Simply because it's a bold book in many ways. And I think Naja is fierce. And this is a book that, yeah, there will be some people who are like, oh, I don't get this. I don't like this. but you cannot say it's not a fierce and strong book. I mean, she is this book, once you get into it, once it gets your claws into you, you realize she knows exactly what she's doing, and she's writing with severe authority, and it's great for that. And when I read it first in Danish, I was struck by that, by the fact that, like, she can have a male character rape of his girlfriend, and then and obviously that's not a good thing, but like the way that she treats that, and the way that the girlfriend's response is, and the fact that she has the courage to delve into that topic and do it in the way that she does is it's marvelous, frankly. And also, the whole crime element. In a sense, this is a crime novel too. And so it's I don't think I ever talked to Naja about whether she was doing this on purpose, and I think she was, but it clearly can be read as a Scandinavian crime novel, but just not the same as any of the others. Like you mentioned Stieg Larsson, it's certainly not that kind of crime novel.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that because, well, I think you maybe heard some of our comments during our weekly reading update when Andy and I first started Rock Paper Scissors, and I think quite a few people in our book club were a little like, "What is going on with this book?" But I think you were spot on when you said that as you read, it kind of hooks you, and then by the end, you really, if you're paying attention, you realize that she's in full command of what she's doing with the story, and nothing was really happenstance in the writing. Everything she put on the page was very deliberate, and it's funny because I kind of am now at this point really judging books more on the conversations that they produce. Not just in the book club, but that's the big part of it, but just the conversations they produce with other people who may have read it. And, there's so many books that we might read and go, oh, that was great. But then we really don't have a whole lot much else to say about it. And so many people in the club were talking about, I don't know if I really like this, but then we're having like 45-minute in-depth discussions about one little scene, and everyone's realizing like, oh, I actually have all kinds of thoughts and opinions about what I just read. And I think that's really like an indicator of a really well-written book. This is probably an absurd question, but did Naja give you any, and you don't have to tell us what that might be, but did she give you any indication of what happened after the story concludes? Because you don't necessarily get a super clear, nice open and shut case on the story. Did she
Sorry,
she's tight-lipped about it, huh?
I'm sorry, I can't. I have no idea. She never said.
I love that.
Well, I do want to add one thing about, there's that, you hear this question asked a lot, or like whether you can tell if the story is written by a man or a woman. I know this to me is a ridiculous discussion, but yet this book, I would ask, if you didn't know who wrote the book, you're not going to think this is a woman who wrote this book, I think. And
100%. And shout out to Marcia in the book club, who even said, like, I had trouble believing that a woman wrote this about several of the scenes in the book. And I saw an interview with Naja where she talked about how that was again intentional, where she wanted to put herself fully in the psyche and like in the shoes of a man writing this, to fully realize Thomas's character, because like the book is very much a commentary on toxic masculinity and the way that men interact with the world, and certainly their emotions.
Yeah.
Can I just say this? I don't know. It doesn't I don't know what it says about men, because it's like, yeah, it feels like it was written by a man because of how like vulgar it is at times,
well, but also
like
there's subtle ways too. I mean, Thomas is, there's a scene in the book in which Patricia basically says, you didn't even ask how I am. You don't even, it's those subtle little things like that are just like, he's not paying attention. It's not just about how vulgar he is or how violent he is. It's about how those little things that he's just not there. He's off in his own little world. He's very self-involved. And I wouldn't say narcissist at all, but like it's on the level of like just being about himself so often. Yeah, I mean, like after the rape scene, he's worried more about buying the second store. So, I think this is part of the genius of the book is that she really inhibits this mindset and just rolls with it. But at the same time, there have these more so-called softer views in terms of poetry when the poetry comes up and there's some tenderness around that as well. And there's I think she's masterful in this particular book. I was always sad that this book didn't get the attention that I felt it deserved for the reasons that you're talking about here.
Yeah, well, another thing that I always appreciate about a book or any piece of art, character-driven art, which is if you can go from loathing a character to then feeling bad for them, having some empathy for them, and flip-flopping between those two things, which I think she did masterfully in this book as well. There's moments where you hate Thomas, and then sometimes you kind of feel bad for him, and same thing with Luke and even Patricia to a degree. Obviously she's a little bit more. Well, I don't want to spoil too much for our audience if they haven't read it, but she's not quite as vile as Thomas can be, but she's not perfect either. So, yeah, it really is an incredibly well written book.
Yeah.
Mike, do you have any other questions for KE?
Yeah, I actually had another one because I'm happy that you mentioned the like the multi-step translation process, because I flagged this in the book of Losman as well, where you said that one of the sentences that drives you the craziest is the phrase "lost in translation."
Yeah.
And then Losman goes on to kind of explain how he does a first draft and he's not worried about syntax and grammar and things like that. So I kind of wanted to know what about that phrase "lost in translation" gets a bit irksome to translators, whether that's your views or Losman's views?
I'll have to say it from my views, and I
Sure.
won't speak for other translators on this, but I think for me, it goes back to the question of how do I say this? It's actually a very difficult question, like in a certain sense. Um, when you're translating something, you're trying to get the tone right, the voice right, and various other strands. And what works, say, in an original may not entirely work in the translation. Um, whether it's just too culturally specific or what. And I think this specific case I was using in that book was in the book of Losman. I mean, I'm going to refer to that specifically because I think you can't take that out of context. Is the scene in that book involves him translating a really ludicrous scene in which essentially the detective is interviewing a suspect and then ends up having sex with her in the bathroom, and while he's still interviewing her about the crime. So I think very specifically of that, and obviously I've never translated a book like this where it's so outlandish. I was thinking more in terms of American sitcoms where everything's ratcheted up 10,000 degrees to the point of absolute insanity. And in that particular case, the translator stuck with a position where it's like, well, if you translate that literally, they're going to think, what the hell is this? Why is this so bad? And I guess I just want to keep referring to that particular passage because that it is a bad scenario for a translator to be involved in a situation where the original is just outlandish without an actual purpose for being outlandish, where it's just like let's make something that belongs in a Lars von Trier movie or something, and let's see how readers think about that. So I hope I'm answering your question that really that, but
Absolutely, and it goes back to another thing I flagged in the book where you do name drop Lars von Trier. He is one of my most hated directors in cinema because I think that he does, in my opinion at least, I know there are cinema nerds that are going to vastly disagree with me. I think that there is a lot of things in his work across all of the movies that he's directed where he is just going for that absolute extreme without a point in pushing things as far as he does in those works. I mean, to say nothing of the reports from many actresses like Bjork included of like I never want to act again after this experience.
Yeah, he's a problematic figure for sure. Certainly sexist, and yet some of his films are actually pretty incredible. I mean, he's
Dancer in the Dark is one of the most affecting movies I've ever seen. I'll never. It's a movie I can never watch again.
in the kingdom.
Particularly the ending of that movie.
I haven't seen it. No spoilers.
I won't. No, I would never. I don't want to talk about it.
Well, you know,
Um,
you talk about rock paper scissors and how it's a very polarizing book. That's Lars von Trier in a nutshell.
100%. He's absolutely polarizing, and I definitely fall on the side of not liking him and thinking that when you continuously put characters in his movies in these situations where you're removing their agency, where you're removing any form of power that they have in the situations, it does come across as misogynistic or sexist. So that's, I think, the lens that I'm coming from it. I do think he is a brilliant artist. Art is great when it evokes an emotion, whether that's love or disgust. It's still effective art. So I would never say that he's not an effective artist. Is certainly one of my least favorite as a result.
Yeah, I stumbled upon a TikTok account the other day that's purely dedicated to ruining your favorite movies by revealing the terrible people that made them. And the one that popped up I saw the other day was The Fifth Element, which is a fantastic movie. And the director of that, I think he like started dating some girl when she was 15 and he was in his 30s, and then they ended up getting married when she was like 20 or something. I don't know. There was a bunch of other stuff to it as well, but I was like, well, that's not great.
I mean, he Cormac McCarthy.
He Cormac McCarthy. So, oh God. Mike, do you have any other questions before I hit my final one?
Yeah. So we kind of touched on this earlier with, the difficulty in translating Danish into English. And I think that probably kind of extends across just Germanic languages in general. And one of the things I wanted to ask about was, I know in Danish, they also have those absurdly long compound words that there is no translation for in English, or no, sensible one. So have you come across something like that in any of those projects that you've worked on where you had to be like, what do I do with this?
I'm laughing here because I will say, and I should be very clear about this, the last book I translated was probably officially in around 2018, I think. So I'm laughing because I don't remember that. I'm sure I did. And probably you can just pull them apart, but I'd have to see the word. And in some cases, they may have an equivalent that's already in English, and you can just change that to what that equivalent is. And that is probably the case. In fact, words like Wobenkaplut, which arms race. It's these are probably words that in some way have already been translated, I'm guessing. But again, it's been a long time and I can't remember any specific instance. So sorry.
No worries. My last question that I had was just, so I started out reading more and more translated literature actually after reading Babel, because translation seemed like such an interesting concept. And really, that was my other reading goal for this year, was really just reading more works in translation. And I, in January, read everything that Hong Kong has published in English or has had translated into English, and found myself getting really attached to Deborah Smith as a translator as a result. So I was wondering, do you have any favorite translators for, whether that's from Danish or anything like that? Is there someone who you really kind of, I guess, look up to as a translator in that sense?
Well, I know a lot of the Danish translators, of course. One that I kind of started with, in a sense, we started translating around the same time, and he's gone, you know, um, to be like a kind of a rock star in Danish translation, is Martin Aidt. And I really admire both his work, his actual translations, and the amount of work he does. But there are so many great, Danish translators that uh, you can easily plug. I mean, Barbara Haviland is I believe she's a finalist for the Booker Prize. I guess she wouldn't have won it. I saw that they announced it today or yesterday. But I believe one of her most recent translations was shortlisted. Uh, and just so many others, and I hesitate to name more because I'm gonna forget some, and I'm gonna feel bad. So, but I would say Martin Aitken is definitely the one that I always think about because, at least in terms of Danish, simply because we started around the same time, and he's probably translated 3 to 4 dozen books at this point, and they're all very good.
Cool. That's a great question, Mike. My final question is not as fun, uh, and it involves a topic that's not really that fun, but there's a lot of discussion in the publishing world in general about AI.
Okay.
We see a lot of publishers moving to AI specifically for their audiobooks, but I'm sure that if there aren't already people doing translations with AI, that's probably around the corner. I'm sure, you know, being purely working as a translator is probably a difficult career anyway, as far as, the amount of work and to be able to make a living doing it. But what are your thoughts on AI as far as the translating piece? And yeah, just generally, what's your perspective on that whole thing?
Yeah, that's definitely not a fun question, but I'm glad you asked it because I have definite thoughts. And first of all, I want to say categorically that I despise AI. I despise that it's being foisted upon us. And not just for the literary arts, but visual arts. I think it's disgusting that we see the president of the United States, so called, who is sharing memes that are so clearly AI. Um, that's a different story, but like just generally AI, I think it's bad news for translators for sure. Um, in the same way that that capitalism is bad for the planet. When you take away a person's labor, and replace it with a machine, you leave very little behind. And obviously, there will be presses out there, unfortunately, who will decide, well, we can just input these 400 pages into ChatGPT and it can translate it in 10 seconds. And then we'll hire somebody to go through and make it sound like a human and pay that person less. And it's bad enough that they've stolen from millions of authors, millions of texts, millions of pages of internet. It's bad enough that's happened, but now they're basically taking that stolen property and turning into ways for authors and translators to basically have no jobs because they're going to be gone. And I'm hopeful that there will be presses who are like, well, you know what? It's worth paying a human a living wage to do this. But the cynic in me has seen how publishers will try to pay less and less for a translation. And I just, I mean, we've seen it when factories went to Mexico, they did it because they could pay people less. And now they're supposedly coming back. No, that's not happening because they're not going to be able to pay them less unless somehow they can do that, which I don't see how that's happening. I guess if you take away the unions, I
Right.
mean, this
Yeah.
could go on for a while because I definitely have takes on this, but
Yeah. It's kind of an interesting discussion for a lot of reasons, but for me, I think I kind of had this epiphany, not anytime recently, but like you can show me a movie that looks incredible, right? It wows me from a purely aesthetic point of view, but there's something about like watching a fake car crash into a fake wall that you kind of start to it loses its luster a little bit. And I think, particularly with the written word and literature, there is something that adds an extra layer of appreciation to know that like another human being like thought these thoughts. And in the case of translation, you sat there and really thought a lot about what was going to be the right way to do it. And even if that's not necessarily textbook perfect, that's actually kind of like the endearing part of it, right? Is like the human aspect of it, is kind of like the flaws or the individual choices made. You're absolutely spot on, in my opinion, about the cost savings. And I think the real tough thing about that situation in particular is that even if a press wants to invest in people, when you're not using the competitive pricing tools, you can easily get crushed in your marketplace. So,
Yeah.
um, Mike, any thoughts on this matter before we?
Yeah, a few. Yeah. So I think it's obviously especially topical when you see, companies like Duolingo firing all of their translators and saying that we're going to move to using AI. It caused me to immediately remove the little green bird from my phone.
I didn't know that.
Um,
That's neat.
they recently laid off all of their full-time translators, and then were looking to get rid of contractors as well in favor of AI. There's been a very large fallout in their usage. Just how many people are using the app. I know a lot of my friends were like, I'm done with this, and rightfully so. Um, I I think AI is such a nuanced topic because on the one hand, you have cancer researchers and environmental scientists using AI prediction models where they're able to calculate amounts of data that would take them weeks to do naturally, and they're able to spend more time extrapolating on that data, versus what we're talking about now, which is like directly removing the human element from things. And I think there's AI is such a nascent technology that we as a large people, as a population, have not gotten to the point yet where we have established ethics and morals and a sense of right and wrong of like where do we draw that line. Obviously, you have some people that want to use it to make the funny pictures that look like Miyazaki's work because they love Spirited Away and they want to have the good brain chemical from that. But on the other hand, you have Miyazaki saying like, I despise this. I don't want any part of this. And we have to, as a collective, start to have those tough conversations about where AI can be an incredible boon for the human race because of the advancements in medicine that are happening because of it. And then where we have to draw a firm line in the sand and say like, we can't cross this.
Yeah.
And obviously, another whole other topic like the democratization of AI and people being able to access it versus it only being accessible by the 1% is a whole nother thing. Like you could do an entire podcast series. Many people
Yeah.
are about AI.
100%, Mike. And one of the dangers is that we are, all that research you mentioned, which I 100% agree with. The U.S. is losing it,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
deliberately so. And what seemed to be replacing it is the coldest, most banal use of AI you can possibly have, and that is just like the entertainment value of it. Which, going back to what Tony said, I would much rather see the flaws. When I was reading this rock paper scissors, I noticed at least 2 times when I there was a missing word, and I was like, well, that as the obsessive person inside me is like itching at that, like I can't believe I did that, or I wouldn't have used this hyphen, or I wouldn't have used this word. All these things come out because I hadn't read this in so long. But that is the human flaw, and there's not a single book you don't read or that you read that you can't find something, generally speaking, that
Yeah.
especially the author. The author will always find some way of of
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up in the punk scene, so like I will always appreciate like a vocalist with a scratchy voice over somebody who's been auto-tuned into oblivion, where like it is that human element of like, I don't care that that singer is a little bit pitchy, because I can get a sense of like, if I go and see them live, they're going to sound exactly the same versus someone that's using a ton of auto-tune where you're like, I don't even know, this could be an entirely different human being. So yeah, I think there's so much, unfortunately, there's so much nuance in there that becomes a really hard line in the sand for people. It's just, I don't
Yeah, I
think
think
AI going anywhere.
I think pretty early on in the AI, when it, especially like Chat GPT and Mid Journey, when those two tools really kind of hit the public space, I saw a meme really early on that I think really just nails it, which is like, I wanted robots to do all my work for me, so I had more time to make art. I didn't want the robots to do the art for me, so I had more time to work. Like,
Yeah.
and that's kind of how I feel about it. But yeah, I would love to end this on a more positive note. So, okay, if you could just tell us a couple of your particular favorite book recommendations. It doesn't have to be translated works, but what do you recommend for the audience to check out other than the Book of Losman, of course?
So I'm a huge fan of Don Delillo's work. And,
Nice.
he's been, he's got to be in his mid 80s now. And I don't know if he's written anything recently, but I'm a huge fan of Underworld, especially. So that is a book that I would like to see maintain. I mean, obviously, he doesn't need me to plug him. He won the National Book Award. He's done all sorts of things. But Underworld is just a rich tapestry of Americana, and I'm a big fan of that. And I would also say, so Mike mentioned scratchy voice singers, and I'm a big Dylan guy, right? So I think Chronicles Volume 1 is not fiction, but it's really Dylan's voice, and for me, Dylan is a huge influence on my work. Those are two that pop immediately to mind. I wish I had known this in advance. I could have come up
I
with
like springing it
more.
on people.
Yeah.
Well, we're big Don DeLillo fans at the Life on Books crew, so Underworld's one of Andy's favorite books. I'm a big fan of White Noise,
Yeah.
so and I just looked it up. He's 88 years old, so he is
Wow.
getting on in
Yeah.
years. So yeah,
We can
and
squeeze
oh, go
one
ahead,
more
Mike.
novel out of him, like we're getting one last pension or
Yeah,
another
one more
pension.
pension. Yeah,
Yeah, they're getting
um,
shorter as he gets older, though.
that, understandably so. So, well, if people want to hear more from you or kind of keep up to date with what you're doing, what's the best place to find you at?
So, yeah, they can go to my website, kesemmel.com, and I do have a Substack that I kind of started a few months ago, and I've been so busy with things that I haven't written as much as I would like to, but I'm going to pick it up soon again. The Substack is called Bright Boy, A Tourette's Life. So, but that you can find a link to on my website, kesemmel.com. And of course, the Book of Losman, it is available as an audiobook too. If people are into audiobooks, it's about a 6-hour audiobook. Read by Tristan Wright. Does an excellent job narrating it. So
Awesome. Well, okay, thank you so much for joining us.
thank you so much, and I appreciate you both for having me on.